It is my pleasure this morning to introduce a man who has this much stuff written about him. A lot of stuff. And first time I talked to him, it seems like he was on the way to Chicago. I think he also was in Italy. He's just come back from a recent trip in Europe where he went to where?
Malta.
Malta.
Medicine and Religion Conference.
Medicine and Religions Conference in Malta. Something we'd all be interested in for sure. He was commissioned by Trappist monk Thomas Keating to be the presenter and coordinator of the Contemplative Outreach Limited and emissary to the M&L Institute for Research on Contemplatives. Thank you. He's the vice chairman and faculty member of, I'm assuming that's the M&L Institute?
No, Institute for Spirituality and Health here in Houston.
Okay, Institute for Spirituality and Health. He's an ordained Catholic deacon and co-founder and president of the Contemplative Network, which is dedicated to interdenominational. You can tell where we come from. Interdenominational Christian contemplative prayer. He is an ex officio board member of the Contemplative Network, and he's a practicing contemplative in the Trappist Christian tradition. I can tell by the way that I'm reading this stuff that we would probably want to hear more from him than about him.
I think so.
Because if we get through all of this, it probably would be time for the talk to be over. So without any further ado, let's welcome Dr. Robert Hesse.
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. I feel like I'm in a Catholic church because there's nobody in the front row. You can tell when you're in a Catholic church in the parking lot, everybody backs in so that when it's over they can rush out much more quickly. This is a presentation that I've given on several occasions, and probably the most recently was at the Pontifical University of Rome to a bunch of priests and seminarians. And it really is Catholic teaching, but it's adding to it some of the biological information that we have now that we didn't have before, which gives it much more depth and meaning and reinforces it. So I just want you to know where I'm coming from. Okay? The subject is conscience and consciousness, which is consciousness is pretty much the frontier of research by scientists. And as part of the Institute for Spirituality and Health here in Houston, very interested in that, and just recently completed a negotiation to use the fMRI facilities of Baylor in studying the effects of prayer. Now, the concept of making moral judgments is rather interesting. There are basically three approaches. And the Catholic Church dabbled in each of these and found out that two of them didn't work. But I think as you talk to people, you'll find that they tend to fall in one of these three categories. One, the basis for a moral judgment is subjective. In other words, it's feelings. I feel that this is not right, or I feel I can do this in my own privacy and it won't hurt anybody. And in its extreme form, it can be very selfish. And quite often, the people that are subjective are the first ones that will tend to look for hypocrisy in the other two. It's interesting that when you're subjective, you can't be accused of hypocrisy very much, because what I think today is different than what I feel tomorrow. Now, I don't mean to be flippant about this, but in its extreme form, it can be very selfish, and it tends to lead to moral relativism. In other words, what's good for me is what's good. Okay? The second is legalistic, and this is the type of person that's perhaps a fundamentalist that says that I'm religious but not spiritual. The subjectivist might say I'm spiritual but not religious. That's not always the case. I'm just suggesting these are some of the road signs. And so the legalist wants to interpret things absolutely literally, usually starting from religious texts, etc. And every faith has some fundamentalists, legalists in it. It doesn't matter what faith it is. Every faith has a contingent that looks upon things legalistically. If I don't eat meat on Friday, if I go to Mass on Sunday, I don't have to love my neighbor. All I got to do is follow the rules. And what's interesting about both of these is that even though they're pretty disparate, they both lead to the same place, and that is we don't have to love others. The first can lead to the point where you only love yourself. The second can lead to a point where if you follow the rules, you don't have to love people. So it's different as those first two are. It's rather interesting that they can lead to the same place. What I'm going to be talking today is a principled approach based on love. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that is a fairer way of approaching things. Now, one of the things that I ask that you would accept, even though you in your own worldview you may not, and that is the concept of non-dualism. Now, I'm not here to speak about other faith traditions, but some faith traditions believe in dualism. Quite often, Eastern traditions will be dualistic. In other words, the body and the soul, in a non-dualistic approach, are interstitially. They're interstitial, they're made for each other. And so, in the physical world, the body, it's reason, it's science, and that's got to be consistent with the spiritual soul, faith, theology. And if they contradict each other, then our interpretation of one or the other or both are wrong. And so this is, I'm asking you to accept this concept of non-dualism, but some worldviews don't have this. So there has to be faith and reason, and they have to be consistent with each other, because the body and soul are interstitial, made for each other. Getting into the subject of consciousness and conscience, there's a Greek word called synodesis, which actually means both of these. The Greeks didn't have a separate word for these two. Consciousness is the external self-awareness. In other words, is it true or is it erroneous? That tree that's out there, if it's really out there, that's consciousness of that external tree, and that is true. So the preference here is to have a true external self-awareness. We're interpreting external and internal, by the way. Consciousness is also internal, to a certain extent. Self-awareness about us ourselves. Conscience is the internal moral guide. So that can either be sincere or insincere. In other words, you can say, well, I don't like this person, so I'm not going to be kind to them. That's insincere. So you want sincere and you want true. Now what's interesting is when I gave this presentation at Rome, we had a simultaneous translator for Italian. And I said, now I don't want to step on her toes. I'm not a linguist, please understand. But it's my understanding that every Romance language has only one word for these two. English is rather interesting. It has two words, which is helpful because the research is focusing on consciousness. And so she came up to me afterwards and she said, I didn't know how to translate consciousness. She said, I used awareness, and I said, well, that's probably the best choice, but it's not. It's more of an expansion of that concept of awareness about the external and the internal. Now, to have an informed conscience, we need three things basically. We need a biologically functioning brain. We need information that's true. And I love the Theosophical Society's focus on truth, because that's key. And I thought I straightened these numbers out, but that last one should be number 3. Okay. And that you need a spiritual base, an indwelling spirit. So those are the 3 requirements to have an informed conscience. And the operative word that I'm going to be pursuing here is the term informed. Now, what was a little bit new to the seminarians and priests in Rome, and I shouldn't say this about them generally, but what I've introduced here is more the biological reinforcement of what an informed conscience is, because science knows more now than it did centuries ago. And I tend to combine faith and science a little bit. That's kind of my interest. So let's talk about the biological first. Has anybody heard of Phineas Gage? Phineas Gage, interesting case. Phineas Gage was a person that worked for a railroad, in New Hampshire in the late 1800s, and his job was to place dynamite charges in long cylindrical holes. And if you've ever driven along a highway where they've broken rock away for the highway or the train, he was doing for a train, you'll see a bunch of semicircle cylinders, horizontal and vertical, every 10 feet or so. And what they do is they put charges in all these holes, and they blow them all at the same time, and then the rock face falls over. Okay? And back in the 1800s, a crowbar was not the shape we know now today. It was this thing that he was holding, straight bar, flat on one end, pointed on the other. Now, Phineas Gage was a church-going person. And by the way, can you hear me in the back of the room? Great. Phineas Gage was a church-going person, didn't womanize, didn't drink, didn't curse. He was an ideal member of society, totally respected. He went to place a charge one day and didn't realize that he had tapped onto a charge that had been placed. It exploded, and the full force of that charge, instead of breaking the rock back, which would have happened if it were capped, launched the rod. The rod went through his skull. Now, if you'll notice in this picture, which was recently discovered in an attic about 5-10 years ago, believe it or not, you notice his left eye is closed? Okay, this is why. Now, it didn't actually hit his eye. It entered the cheek and exited the top of his head here. Now, this is a very rare event in the sense that he survived it. And the reason he survived it is, number one, it was a clean entry and exit, and it was hot, so it cut the bleeding off, okay? And so cauterized it basically. So what they did is they closed the entry and exit wounds as best they could, let the skin grow back, and everything seemed pretty good. He couldn't use his left eye too well, you could see, but Phineas Gage was a different person. Phineas Gage started to curse, started to womanize. He drank. He was an alcoholic. He was not respected by society. His society condemned him. Science has discovered that, and you'll have to excuse me, on my PowerPoint, which is on a different computer, I see the next slide, so I have to kind of get my head together. It also has my notes, so. What science has discovered is that conscience is pretty much located in the frontal lobes. That's where we make our moral decisions. So if those frontal lobes are damaged, then you've got a problem. Now, they exhumed his body about 25 years ago, roughly. As I give these talks, I have to keep thinking I got to revise that number. And determined that, yes, his frontal lobes were completely wiped out. And so science has come in other cases, not as dramatic as this one, come to the conclusion that that's where the moral judgment is made. And so it might be a massive elimination of the frontal lobes, or it may be a subtle chemical imbalance that won't show up on a CAT scan or fMRI. Either way, if those aren't working, moral judgment is affected. Now we go to Michael May. Has anybody heard of Michael May? Another interesting case. Michael May there was an accident when he was 3 months old, and it destroyed his vision. And he later got married, had children, and he was in his mid-40s roughly when science discovered that they might be able to restore his vision. Now this is another very unusual case. Restoring sight that's been out from birth, almost birth, is very unusual. And so they went to unwrap the bandages, and they had his children and his wife in front of him. And he had this tremendous view now of his children and his wife for the first time. And everybody's in awe watching it worked. Well, there was a problem. He couldn't remember his wife's face from one day to the next. He couldn't tell the difference between the forest and the trees. His depth perception was off. He had other issues. He could tell a ball coming, but he couldn't tell if it was a ball or a cube. So there were some serious problems. What science realized that, now keep in mind now, before mid-age gauge we were talking about conscience. Now with Michael May we're talking about consciousness. What is his perception of the outside world? So we're covering both sides of synodesis. Okay.
Tell us
What's
what
his
that means again, synodesis.
Synodesis means both conscience and consciousness. And now science is splitting those two, even though the Romance languages haven't gotten it and don't have a word for it. But now science saw conscience in the frontal lobes. Now they're looking for consciousness. And here's a case study that says, this is an interesting study. Quite often, or case study, quite often science learns from the anomalies, not from the normal. And so what was going on? Well, science knows that the brain wires itself as we're growing up. And the reason is that we're bombarded with data in this world, so much so that the conscious brain can't handle it. And so we build worldviews so that when we see something like that, that's a hint that this is what it is. And so the mind starts wiring itself. Only 5% of the brain is conscious. The other 95% is unconscious. And so what Michael May was faced with was building his unconscious, building his worldview. And so it's interesting, Newberg, who wrote How God Changes the Brain, wrote that he believes that we are all wired for faith. And the way I look at that is that we're wired to have to fill in the unconscious worldview so that we can drink in the data, because our conscious mind can't handle all the data. Now, as if to show that that's the case, Michael May, this happened, the surgery I think was about 15 years ago. He now has improved. His brain is wiring even at an older age. Interesting. So, I talked to at a presentation by Dr. Singer, who's in Germany, who studies consciousness. He said when we look at consciousness, the whole brain lights up on an fMRI. I mean, he said, we can't find it. And a recent book that said The Proof of Heaven by Evan Alexander, who actually came to Houston and gave a talk a few weeks ago. I was out of the country. I wanted to talk to him.
He'll be at our national conference.
Pardon me?
He'll be at the Theosophical Society National Conference speaking.
Oh, great, great. Well, he was a neurosurgeon and believed as a scientist that all consciousness is in here. His opinion now is, and I won't go into that case study, but you can read the book and hear his talk, having had near-death experience that was so dramatic, and also being a neurosurgeon and knowing that a E. coli infection wipes out complete use of the brain, and he was in that 0.5% that survived. His near-death experience was so dramatic that now his worldview is shifted. He believes that consciousness is outside the brain and that the brain is a filter because we can't handle it all. So, conscience, we know pretty much where it is. Consciousness, scientists, we don't know.
What was his name again? The name?
Eben Alexander, and it's
Proof of heaven.
yeah, it's proof of heaven.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry.
Now, the parietal lobes are usually the lobes in the back that pretty much drink in all this sensory perception outside. And so to reinforce this Michael May issue, I mean, you talk about the 5 senses and the input that gives you, but there's a dramatic difference between sight and insight. As a homilist and a deacon, I love I'm going to diverge here a little bit, I love the scriptural discussion where Jesus heals a person and a man, and he says, now, don't go telling everybody, just kind of, and he kept coming back because he remembered Jesus' face. He was given insight. Sight was not the issue with him. He was given insight. Michael May couldn't remember his wife's face. Now, consciousness, total brain, so it's a little bit a reinforcement of what I just said. Now, collective, there is such a thing as collective synodesis, in other words, collective consciousness and collective conscience. So collective consciousness is in medicine and science. If you have a lot of the doctors and scientists, medical doctors and scientists agreeing on something, there starts to be a collective consciousness. So for example, pretty well accepted that there's the Big Bang Theory, pretty well accepted the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, a bunch of scientific principles, pretty well accepted. And so you're having a collective consciousness present there. And you also have collective conscience. So the religion and that we may belong to has certain beliefs and teachings about what's right and what's wrong. And the state also has some laws dictating, well, you can't kill this person, you can't kill people, this, etc. So there is a collective conscience. And that means the state can incarcerate somebody if they break the law. But I'm not going to talk about that concept. I'm going to get into something different as we get along, and you'll start to see this. Remember those 3, biological, informational, and spiritual. Now we're going to talk about the informational. In the Christian tradition, the Catholic tradition, is that the basis of the information is love. And I give you a new commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. In other words, loving God and loving neighbor. That's the basic principle. The question is, how do you interpret that and how do you apply it? Religious teachings, faith and reason. Faith, do good, reason, respect life. Again, constantly getting back to faith and reason. You may look to moral authority of a church that you belong to, or our natural law, which is, again, faith and reason. Now, when the brain is wiring itself, if you live in Tibet, in all likelihood, you're going to build a worldview that's Buddhist. Not surprising. So you are influenced by your environment when you are building a worldview in your unconscious. Okay? Now, when we apply the principled approach, which is what we were talking about before at the very beginning. You've got to have some principles and prioritize them. The first principle is ordinary human dignity. Now, what that means is, and what you're going to see is each one of these will trump the ones below. So the first principle trumps the rest. The second principle trumps the rest below that. And so ordinary human dignity is when you don't withhold food, water, clothing, shelter to people. And so you got to this love principle. It's really based on Jesus' principle of love. Now, as we go through this, you're going to find that that the source of this originally was Augustine in the 4th century. And you're going to find that these same principles are applied to the just war theory, which has got some problems of its own, but I'm not going to get into that. I just wanted to point out kind of the origin of this and how these principles are laid out. You don't intentionally kill. So, letting someone die is different than intentionally killing them. And so you can't let somebody die by withholding food, because then you're violating the first principle. So you do the first principle, and then if somebody has cancer and they're dying and they choose not to take medication, then you are not killing them by allowing them to die. If you overdose them on morphine with the intention of killing them, then you're violating number 2. Now, this gets into bioethics, and it comes back to this dualism, non-dualism issue. Non-dualism is really holistic. Dualism leads to some very interesting and, I think, tough issues when it gets to bioethics. I've been at conferences where certain religious beliefs have a dualistic belief, and it leads them into some really tough issues. The third principle is honor patients' wishes. So I'll give you some personal examples of these. My father was going to die in a few days. We knew medically that. And when I saw him, he was in pain. And so I told the nurse that he was in pain. I think she should give him some painkiller. And I left, and then I talked to him on the phone later. And of course, I didn't know that that violated his wishes. But he was upset. He said, I want to be conscious for my transition. Now, I didn't intentionally violate Rule 3, but basically, if I had known that he didn't want it, you can't give it to him, okay? I'll give you an example by my mother for number 2. I talked to her about a hypothesis, a scenario that could happen. She was in her 80s, and I said quite often people fall, break a hip, then they have a catheter, and then they develop an infection, and then you're faced with problems. And I pointed out what Mrs. Kennedy went through. She had a serious illness that was going to cause her a lot of pain, and she got an infection, talking about John Kennedy's wife, and she elected not to have antibiotics. Now, in some hospitals, that's the 4th level DNR. Each hospital has little different levels, but that's pretty much the highest level, and that is don't give people antibiotics. So we did not give my mother antibiotics, because when I talked to her about this scenario, I said, "What would you want us to give you antibiotics under those circumstances?" And she said no. We were not intentionally killing, and we were honoring her wishes. Minimize patient's suffering. This gets back to my father's situation. I was applying this principle, but he trumped me. Okay. Now, when you apply these principles, instead of being subjective or legalistic, this really engages us in a moral decision-making process. Now, the problem in applying these principles is that it's never clear cut. You get 2 effects or 3 effects, okay? So how do you handle that? There may be a question of surgery. Well, what are the chances of survival? How old is the patient? So what are some of the things that have to be considered when you're not making a clean decision over a moral decision over one effect as a result of something? And this really kind of captures the Augustine approach. Act or omission can't be evil. By the way, I misspoke. This is the Augustine approach. Act or omission can't be evil in and of itself. That means that, and one of the questions I get quite often is, well, what about a mother who's is pregnant? You can't intentionally kill either one of them. You make a moral judgment on a double effect, and it may be you're doing something else to try to help, but who knows? Intent must be good, and you can't intentionally hurt somebody, with the intent of hurting. The good can't result from the bad, and the good must be greater or equal to the bad. Now you can see a little bit of the just war theory of this thing, but these are the moral principles that are applied in the hospitals here. And when I talk to chaplains and doctors, more often than not, they don't realize the origin of these principles. They don't realize it's Augustine. They don't realize that the second largest, I think the second or first largest medical hospital system in this country are Catholic hospitals. And so it's not surprising this came in through the Catholic tradition. Now, but applying these is a struggle. And here's how you have to, here's the struggle. When you have a double effect, or a triple effect, or a quadruple effect, what do you take into consideration? Now, these are not all inclusive, they're not ranked, but you've got to ask yourself these questions. What's the probability of success? What's the potential for death? What's the expected lifespan? I mean, if it's a 6-year-old child, you're going to do a little bit more than for a 90-year-old person, and take that into consideration. What's the life quality? What's the patient's age? Are there secondary illnesses to take into account? What are the side effects? Caregiver struggle is an issue. I was in the waiting room of a hospital, and this family, who was not that well informed about these principles, had been told that their mother was going to be in a vegetative state. That was the doctor's assessment, and would stay in that state. The family decided they were going to keep her alive, and they were going to basically keep her alive at home. So that affects the 2 issues here, were caregiver struggle and economic impact. They were saying they were prepared to bankrupt their family and their children's future to keep the person that's in a vegetative state alive. So you notice I'm not making a judgment here. I'm just saying that these are the things that have to be considered when applying the prioritized principles. So it's not always easy. And so to be informed, you've got to get information to make these double effect decisions. And where do you get it? Well, you get it from your religious teachings, you get it from sacred scripture, natural laws, civil laws, medical experts, scientific studies, and spiritual advisors. Again, not all inclusive, but we have to inform ourselves before we can apply principles. And so talking to the doctors, getting different doctor experts, if you have to call in another different expert, what's their opinion? And it helps sometimes to seek out a doctor who has similar moral principles to you, because otherwise they can start prescribing or having opinions about things that are a little bit off-center from your own belief system. But here is the problem. Science has discovered that every human being on Earth suffers from confirmation bias. They've done studies on this to show that we have a worldview that's built up from childhood. Remember the unconscious worldview. And that when we get data later on coming into the conscious mind, that 5%, we selectively choose the data that reinforces our preconceived worldview. And if it doesn't reinforce it, we ignore it. And so they do studies, and they find out people can't even remember the evidence that they were presented that violated the worldview. All they remember is what they latched onto. And I'm sure that if we all analyze ourselves, and it's true of humanity, it's just being human, that you're in a compromised situation. You've got to depend a little bit on your worldview, but you also have to be prepared to challenge it. And humans don't generally challenge it when they're presented with data that doesn't support it. So there's rationalization, there's automatic and unintentional decisions being made. They're not deliberately deceiving, trying to deceive people. It's cognitive and mechanistic. It happens like this. To get the evidence that confirms your beliefs, you have irrational primary effect, which means you think there is a primary effect, but it's irrational. And you latch on to illusory correlations, which happens quite often with statistics. People can misread statistics to suit them. So how do we overcome this confirmation bias when we're trying to make moral judgments? I'm giving you now Catholic teaching. Okay? I'm not trying to convert you. In fact, just to confirm that I'm not here to convert, Catholic teaching says that you don't have to be Catholic or Christian or even a theist to go to heaven. Catholic teaching says that the informed conscience trumps everything. So if we really do due diligence in informing our conscience, and the Pope says just to do something that our informed conscience tells us is morally wrong, Catholic teaching says that we have to follow our informed conscience and not the Pope. Because if we don't, we're morally culpable. Now, it's kind of unlikely, okay, maybe that the Pope's going to do that. I mean, he may tell us don't eat meat on Friday. Well, that's like not a morally wrong thing. But there have been historical situations where that could have come into play. The Crusades, etc. But this kind of thinking is in developing. So truth is constantly, God is constantly exposing ourselves to more and more truth through science and natural law and faith. So when is somebody morally culpable? Three things have to be present. The act or omission has to be morally wrong, and this can be determined by the informed conscience. And not only can it be, but it has to be. We have an obligation to do that. And here we go. I don't know, these numbers got screwed up. That's number 2. Okay. You have to have full knowledge, and you have to have full freedom. But only God can climb in our brains and know whether we have full knowledge and full freedom. So, I co-taught a course, a graduate class on faith and science. And it was right around the time when there was this guy, mass killing, I forgot which one it was. And one of the students, a wonderful lady, just a blessed soul, of a different Christian denomination, she was just so upset about this. She said, how can he be evil to do that? And I said, maybe he was Phineas Gage. Maybe he was Phineas Gage. So, what is this leading us to? What this leads us to is that we can never say somebody sinned, because we can't climb in their brain. We have an obligation to apply our principles, but we can't say they've sinned. And I've heard Catholic priests good Christian pastors, whatever, use the term sin in two ways, and only one in my view is valid. One way is, here's the question that I posed to the seminarians in Rome. I said, at the beginning, I said, I'd like to have a prayer. I'd like to ask God to give us the insight as to whether there is sin, there can be sin without a sinner. Or can there only be a morally wrong act or omission? So then, you've heard people say, oh, we condemn the sin but not the sinner. But when you say you condemn the sin, you're implying that there was a sinner. The whole message I was trying to get across, and I'm trying to get across, is we've got to not have our belief systems painted by the fundamentalists of our faiths, such that they will say, that person sinned. All we can say is they've done a morally wrong act in our informed conscience. And it's really the basis for compassion. Pope John Paul II said, there may not be anybody in hell. He didn't say hell didn't exist. He said there may not be anybody in hell. That's why Pope Francis, you hear him say, how am I to judge this person who's gay? You can't. That's what he's saying. The secular press will say, oh, he's changed his principles on it. No, he's saying that I can't judge that person. Only God can judge a person. All we're asked to do is love. So, I was on a soapbox there for a while, I'm sorry. Spiritual. How do we get over this confirmation bias? Prayer. And there are two types. There's discursive, where we're either saying words verbally or in our mind prayers that are thoughts, and which is cataphatic, and contemplative, which is apophatic. Now, science has shown that if we practice prayer, particularly the contemplative prayer, that the brain grows. There's neuroplasticity. Now, what's interesting is science has always been struggling with static versus dynamic. Scientists thought the universe didn't expand. Einstein got caught. His own equations showed that it expanded, and even he put a fudge factor in his equations to stick to his unconscious worldview, and he was wrong. In fact, Father Lemaitre's Catholic priest was one of the ones that went to him and said, you might want to reconsider. We think your equation is right, that it is expanding, which has since been proved. The same held here. Neuroscientists thought for a long time it didn't change. It will expand. And guess where it expands? Preferentially. Frontal lobes. Frontal lobes are the youngest part of the brain. So, are we evolving to be much more globally conscious and more able to make moral decisions through prayer? And so,
Did you hear about this study of, there was a study done, and they would put people they would have a group screaming, and they would measure the brain response of the audience. But then they took some people that were meditators or contemplators, and they measured their brains, and their brains did not react the same way to the screams as the other group. The first group, they responded with fear, they were upset, and they were overwhelmed, but the people that contemplated or meditated, they responded with, their brain showed compassion and empathy. It wasn't, their brain didn't freak out. It went into a more supportive mode.
well, I don't know of that study, but there have been studies where they expose somebody to Mother Teresa dealing with people. And there is an effect, but they have to do it in an fMRI facility. MRI is a photograph. Functional magnetic resonance imaging is a movie. And so, but there are studies that are like that. I just not know that particular one, but that's true. So the question is now, science is kind of coming to the same conclusion that faith has come to, and that is prayer is very important. Interstitial, body, soul, non-dualistic. Okay. And now we have science kind of supporting that. Again, faith and reason. So, there are physical effects, and I know most of you here are contemplatives and pray that way, but you know that there's brain growth now. I just mentioned it. Lower blood pressure, less melancholy, less nervous, less suffering, less anger, less sleep. And spiritual effects, the gifts of the Spirit. I've observed this. I teach century prayer, which is a concentrated form of contemplative prayer. There are two types. The guided meditation, engagement of the imagination, which is what you did at the beginning. And the other is a concentrative form of contemplative prayer, which is a mantra, meaning in the Christian tradition, a sacred word, image, of meaning that is a symbol of your desire to be with God. And so I practice the latter. And I've found that most people report peace, but God seems to know, pretty smart guy, seems to know our gal. Our images have to change. I gave a presentation. How much time do we have here?
You've got plenty of time. You've got 25 minutes.
25 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, we have time for questions. I was giving a talk at the Vineyard Church, which is a wonderful...
Or you can take longer than that.
Pardon?
You can take longer than that. We'll just say that.
Well, it's a Vineyard Church. It was a wonderful group of people, very socially conscious, helping the poor. And I gave an image of God as the fluid in the woman's womb embracing us and feeling the warmth of that fluid and the heartbeat of our mother. And that is what God is doing. That is God for us. And she raised her hand. She said, I've never heard that image before. And I had a little fun with her. I said, the spiritual leaders throughout the centuries have all said the same thing. We have to constantly change our image of God. Worldview, familiar? Change our image of God, because if we don't change our image of God, we run the risk of making God in our image rather than her image. It's true. And so what happens, and I have some scientific background, and so I can't do anything without some sort of flow diagram. I mean, I'm kind of a nutcase this way, so this is not officially recognized by anybody except what I put in. So the free will is really the gatekeeper. And so the conscience, the internal God, with the help of the Holy Spirit, present through prayer, says, the free will tells the conscience, and this is obviously happening much more complexly, more complex than this. I've got a problem, I need your advice, and conscience comes back and gives advice. Now, the free will can say, I don't care about my conscience, I'm feeling good about this. Subjectivism. So, by doing that, the free will say, I'm going to choose self. Or, the free will can go get the input. Then the free will can say, I don't like what the conscience told me, I'm still going to go here. Or it can go to the good, or God. Then it seeks, the conscience says, I don't have enough information, I'm not informed, so go get some more information on the outside. Talk to the doctors, talk to the scientists, or pastors, or whatever. And then they get the data back. And the free will says, I don't like what Father so-and-so said. So, the heck with it, I'm going to choose this. Or I can choose this. Or I can go back, give the data back to the conscience, comes back again, and then make that decision again. So at every step of the way, we've got this gatekeeper. And so this interaction between conscience and consciousness is the way I think of it. But this is not necessarily present, nor is this present in a damaged brain. And so we can make principled decisions about what we think is right and wrong, but ultimately we can't climb into somebody's brain. And so with what I have found with contemplative prayer is, in the concentrated form, is that did you want to keep looking at it? I'll leave it up. Is that thoughts will come and I gently let them go. But the thoughts can become very healing. So the divine healer starts to give us truth and challenges us to overturn our confirmation biases. And so that through prayer, that's the way I believe divine help comes to overcome that natural human tendency of confirmation bias. I had and the brain doesn't want to deal with it without that help. I had a man that I taught centering prayer to, which is a Trappist tradition, and the sacred word. And about 3 months later, he came back and I said, "How's it going?" He said, "Well, I started to dream at night what happened to me in Vietnam." I said, "Then what did you do?" And he said, "Then I became fully aware during the day." Now, I didn't know about this history of him, but it was clearly PTSD. I said, "What did you do then?" And he said, "I ever so gently let it go and returned to God." I told that to one of the board members. I'm on the board of the Institute for Spirituality and Health. One of the board members is the head of the psychiatric department of Baylor, and I told him that story. His mouth dropped. He said, "We are having difficulty treating PTSD patients." I went to the VA hospital. They have whole floors of PTSD patients. And so I'm very interested in getting research done on this prayer practice. Now, here's the challenge. There is plenty of research, primarily done by Buddhist practitioners in Buddhism, showing that meditation is very healing. They've done a wonderful job. There is a whole batch of scientific data contained mainly in the Handbook of Religion, Medicine and Religion it was edited by Koenig, Koenig. It's the Bible on religion's effect on health, which is not always good, by the way. If you have a bad religious belief that God is going to beat you up when you walk out the door, it's not exactly healing. And so this big, thick of a book, in fact, he was the keynote speaker in Malta. Unbelievable. Just a brilliant guy out of Duke University, MD, psychiatrist. And so my issue is we've got this data saying religion is very important, and we've got this data saying secular meditation is very important. Why don't we take advantage of both when we live in a country that is 90+% theistic? I mean, we'd be foolish not to. So that is what has partly led to this agreement with Baylor to do some studies on, and that particular study is going to be on patients who have had depression and are not, but it's mild depression, not major depression, and engaged in this. So that, are there any questions?
Give us a minute to think. Give us a minute to think of the question.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's been studies, because I follow the question, okay? What is the effect of our current technology on the development of consciousness.
Developing of consciousness.
Yeah. Because, you know, you were talking about being contemplative to increase the brain function. And in today's world, everybody lives on that cell phone and they have this kind of attention span. It has to do damage, I would think, biologically.
Yeah. I'm not versed on the research on that in that area,
Yeah.
but we know that people get killed on the highways when they're texting.
We know that. I'm sure do.
So death is one of the side effects. Have a big deal, you know, death. What I find interesting about this technology world we live in is there are two sides to it, and the good and the bad, yin and the yang, morally good, morally evil, you know, the whole 9 yards throughout the history.
Sure.
On the one hand, people are not having a very long attention span, and they don't know how to interrelate with other people,
Right.
and that's frightening. I see it in the young people, and they get their information from sources that are just weird. I mean, the young people, I was in Portugal a couple weeks ago and dealt with some young people, and they're just clueless about history and but they have their biases, and I wonder where they get this stuff. I mean, one of them said, one of them was a tour guide for a Catholic church, and he was an atheist, which is okay, and then kind of strange, but I mean, you know, it's okay. And then he announced to me that the church tried to kill Galileo. I said, what? I said, they never tried to kill him. You know, he's got his history, but he's got that attitude. There's an attitude there. So it's kind of frightening that they get their information and they don't know what's truth. And the attention span's sharp, and they don't know how to interact with people. That's dangerous. That's the bad side. The good side is this a form of collective consciousness that can be very indicative of where we as human beings are headed? Are we evolving in the Teilhard de Chardin, the fluid Teilhard de Chardin? His thinking was we're evolving toward the Omega, which is God, but we never reach God. And in that evolution, this is what's happening. We are becoming much more conscious through consciousness, an expanded form of consciousness of what's going on in India, or something happens and a lot of people are killed in another country, you know about it right away. So there's a potential good side to this. But to answer your question, I'm not versed on the research.
Is there research being done on it, you think?
I think there is, but I'm not sure. I haven't seen it that much on consciousness, which is kind of my interest. But it's certainly been done on statistical analyses of car accidents. You know.
It seems to me like you're giving a lot of power to the people who control the information.
I think I would look at it a different way. I don't think there's some big plot. I think the problem is you've got everybody can put information up, whether it's true or not. And I think a lot of cases they believe it is, but it's completely bogus. And so it challenges us to our informed conscience. It really challenges us to inform our conscience in more depth and to seek out people who are more expert. It's the youth that I'm concerned about.
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too.
Not all at once.
It's inevitable that most people will occasionally make moral errors. What is your viewpoint on guilt? I mean, you're a Catholic. Catholics know a lot about guilt, right?
I said to a good Jewish friend of mine, Rabbi, I said, you know, we are the best at guilt. He said, no. He said, we invented it. I said, yeah, but we perfected it. I think I think guilt is important, but you can have unhealthy guilt, where you become so scrupulous that you lose perspective and informed conscience. And so when I'm ministering to people, I think you can't try to climb in their brain and tell them what to do. But quite often, I can see this extreme guilt where they're so extreme, it's scrupulosity to the point where it's almost clinical, you know? And then others that have no guilt whatsoever. And so, how much of their brain is playing a role in this, I don't know. But guilt is good, provided it's not extreme. You need a little bit of that Holy Spirit within makes us feel a little uneasy sometimes. He can be kind of a pain in the rear end.
So is guilt fear-based, or is it based on something else?
Huh?
Is guilt fear-based, or is it based on something else?
Well, you're asking me about those three areas: information, biological, and spiritual. I think it could be something else in all three of those categories. And so it could be something else biologically, in the sense that there is some damage to the frontal lobes. There could be something wrong informationally, because people think they did something wrong and that it really wasn't morally wrong, because if they had informed their conscience. I'll give you an example. My brother didn't want to withhold antibiotics from my mother. So there was some guilt there. We had to talk it through. The nurse applied the antibiotics against the DNR. And I had to go, and I could have gotten her fired, but I didn't. I spent 45 minutes discussing with her, and she said, "But we loved your mother." And I said, "But you didn't respect her wishes. I know what they are." And I talked her into stopping. So it can be informational. And then, of course, it can be spiritual. There's this gnawing spirit saying, this isn't right. So I know I'm not answering your question, but that gets back to these three areas and why each of us have to make that decision, and we have to seek information from a spiritual director or a spiritual companion. I like that word better. Other people who are experts, so that we don't get caught in the two extremes of guilt, no guilt or scrupulosity. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Sure sounds complicated, but that's okay, I'm complicated too.
There's no simple answer. I mean,
Yeah, I was thinking that use the analogy of patients and illnesses and that sort of thing in terms of making moral judgments and so on. There's one school of thought in religion that says that life is sacred and that it's a God thing. God gave you life, and you therefore do not have the right to take away that life, even if it's your own life. You have no right to do that. So, and it's been my understanding that one of the beliefs of the Catholic Church and many other religions is that life is sacred. And that God
principle
only,
number one, what you're
God
describing
only
is
has
this.
the right to take a life. So if that's the case, then just because you want to withhold antibiotics from yourself, by that philosophy, you don't have the right to make that determination.
Who does?
God.
So if you're the
He doesn't get that he doesn't believe this, he's just making an argument.
yeah,
There's
you're,
no
yeah,
way he
there's
believes.
what you're stating.
I'm not supporting this belief, by the way.
Oh no.
I'm a moral relativist myself, but a moral relativist that believes in the unity of all, in the non-duality of all. So there isn't a selfish component to it. My moral relativism has to do with the relativity of all. My sense of right and wrong comes from the all, not from the self.
Now what you stated is your belief, and I respect that.
Right.
But the question is, now you've got this lady who doesn't want antibiotics.
Right.
Now, are you going to play a role in forcing that on her?
No.
But you're maintaining your informed conscience decision,
Right.
on which is what you would enforce on yourself if you were in that circumstance.
That's correct.
Wonderful.
but I wouldn't force it on her.
Yeah, so I think we're on the same page here.
Yes, we are on the same page, but I wouldn't be on the same page as somebody else that says that God has decided that your life is sacred and only He gets to make the decision. By the way, I'm speaking for God now, so you don't get the right to do that.
I try not to speak for God too much. I think the principle of love and dignity is being interpreted differently by you than it is by this teaching here.
Right.
But that's wonderful for you to apply to yourself, and I think that's wonderful. The question is, if somebody else has a different principled belief, like this woman who doesn't want antibiotics, my mother, and me, under certain circumstances, I wouldn't condemn that person. I wouldn't say that they were sinning. In my own informed conscience, I would say that it's morally wrong.
Would you condemn the nurse that then would override that decision?
No, I didn't condemn her. What I did is I informed her conscience, and then she stopped. I could have civilly condemned her, and civil law has a right to impose justice on that woman. But I'm not talking about civil law, I'm talking about moral law. And some people will question me, say, well, you mean that we can't put people in jail if they commit crime? I said, not at all, that's collective conscience. Civil authority has a right to do that. But we have the ability to have an informed conscience to agree with it or not. So I'm respecting your viewpoint, but that's not my viewpoint in terms of the ranking of the principles. Now, I would be interested to see how you rank principles. I went to a Jain conference in California and supposedly gave the Christian perspective, and I said I can't do that because I can't represent all of Christianity. And then they didn't have a rabbi. I got a rabbi farm for this conference. It was at Lincoln University, and it was sponsored by the Jains. Are you familiar with Jains?
Yes, do know her.
Wonderful, wonderful people. I'm just a wonderful friend that's Jain. My wife was ill at the time, and she since died. She died about a year ago. We were married 45 years. And she had a blood clot, and she was getting in the hospital a medication that was made from the intestines of pigs. I can't remember the name of it. Now, when I was out there, Jane would say, she can't use that medication because you've got to kill pigs to get it. Which is putting all life on the same level. That's not what Christianity does. Now, you don't torture the pig, okay? But what it does, when I'm saying this, not because I'm an expert on Jain bioethics, but quite often Eastern traditions have dualism, and particularly if you're going to be reincarnated, you got a different body later, so it's dualism. And it's okay, that's their belief. I'm not condemning it, but I am saying that it leads to a very interesting interplay of making moral decisions. And I applied the principles to a medical situation, but these principles could be applied to other parts of life. Are we friends?
I'm not attacking what you presented here, I was just making an observation. That's
Oh, no, and I know you were, and I hope I addressed it
You did.
fairly.
I asked yours first because I really do.
Oh, well, the way, I'm a little confused with your use of non-dualism. My experience of the word non-dualism is from the Vedas, which is, a 5,000 or 6,000 year tradition from the East. And so when you talk about the East having a dualistic philosophy.
Generally, I'm not trying to make a blanket statement.
But I'm just not clear, when you say dualism, I know that she's not clear what you're saying when you say non-dualism. I know it from another perspective, but from your perspective, I don't understand what you're saying about non-dualism.
I had a feeling I shouldn't go there because I'm not an expert on Eastern tradition. Okay? I just have run into dualism more there. Now, what do I mean by dualism and non-dualism?
Right, what is your?
Dualism means the body and the soul are separate, and they exist separately, and that can lead to taking your own life under certain circumstances. But that in some traditions they would not call it suicide. It's very interesting. They will define it differently, but ultimately it would be taking their own life because their soul is the most important thing. Their body is separate, and they'll get another body later. So I'm not speaking for all Eastern tradition. I'm just saying that that can be a factor when the body and soul are looked upon as separate.
A good example of
Christian
that.
tradition,
A good example of that would be someone who, for strong convictions, sits and lights themselves on fire.
lets
And they
himself
don't
what?
consider
On
themselves
fire.
on fire. They don't consider themselves committing suicide.
Correct. That's
And
my
that's a dualistic.
That's my understanding,
Yeah.
and it's because
And
their
it's
concept is dualistic. This concept is non-dualistic or holistic, where the body and soul are interstitial. And so they're meant for each other, and in the Christian tradition, you're reunited with your body after you die. Now, how does that happen when the body's rotting in the grave or it's been incinerated? I believe it's in a certain expanded state of consciousness. Okay. So how it works, I can't speak, but the point is that the body that we have and our soul are made for each other, and that's non-dualistic. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, I wanted another one that kind of would feed into that. Well, actually, it's two questions.
We can't hear you back here.
I've basically two questions. The first one is, do you interchange spirit and soul? Would they be the same to you? And the second is, now that you've clarified, so mind and soul are the same, where would that be in this model? And where would subconscious be? Where would the id, the ego, the superego be?
Did you get into the questions? Am I equating spirit and soul?
As the same, or are they different?
Spirit with a capital S is God.
Okay.
And and most Abrahamic traditions, the Abrahamic traditions believe that God dwells within. I've been through this because in Chicago, I put together a panel of contemplative presenters, a Jewish rabbi, a Kabbalist, a Muslim Sufi, and I gave a Christian. And the whole basis was that God dwells within. So that spirit with a capital S dwells within us. And it is interstitial with this soul that I don't understand, but some will speak as if they're the same, but they're really not. We have part of ourselves in this too. So we're in this divine dance with God. And that divine dance is His spirit, and our soul is there, is the housekeeper. I've never said that before. The second question was,
Using Freud's terminology, where would the id, the ego, the superego, and the subconscious be in your model?
Here's something I learned because I wasn't, not smart enough to have all the answers.
Right.
I use the word subconscious around my friend on the board who's head of this. I was giving a presentation at the Institute, and he took issue with me using the word subconscious. And the term subconscious is a layman's term. The scientific, psychological term is unconscious. And so that unconscious is the 95% of the brain that tells our heart to keep beating and for us to breathe. And we consciously may say, well, I'm going to stop and think about this and stop my heart. Well, good luck. Or stop breathing. So the unconscious is that 95%. Now, I'm not a psychiatrist or a student of that too much, but I would say that in the spiritual terminology that I'm used to, there's the false self and the true self. And the false self is driven by, as humans, we're driven to seek joy. In fact, we're designed for joy. We're made for joy. And the false self seeks joy in the wrong places. There are like 3 energy centers. There's power, pleasure, control. I don't know if I have them all right, but they're like 3 energy centers, okay? And so some people will seek it in drugs or sex. Some people will seek it in power and control. Others in security.
Survival, that's the survival.
Yeah, pardon?
You said power, control, and something, two of them you said.
Power,
It's power,
pleasure, and security.
And survival,
I think those are the
security.
3.
Yeah, there's,
And so security, you spend your whole life trying to save money for retirement. And so you're not happy. You seek pleasure in drugs and sex, etc. Short-term happiness, you're not happy in the long term. Power, if everybody else listens to me and I can boss them around, I'm happy. Well, none of these gives happiness. And this is this search for the false self is what's driving it. The true self, and here's where the terminology I think is rather interesting. The true self is the Holy Spirit dwelling within. The closer we come to that true self, the happier we will be over the long term and more joyous. And so this resting in God in contemplative prayer brings us closer to that true self. And so in spiritual terms, the terms false self and true self are used more often, not necessarily psychologist terms of healing, etc. I'm not an expert at that area. I don't know if I've answered your question.
you're aware.
And as far as this is concerned, it doesn't take into account where this is.
Right.
Remember we talked about that? Is this all in the brain? That isn't. That's interstitial. The Holy Spirit's interstitial throughout. People who have reported contemplative experiences, serious ones, have a total body, out of body.
Right.
So this can't be all, this isn't in the brain by itself. Conscience is, we know pretty much. This is probably outside the brain, partially. It may be a filter, like even Alexander says. The truth is, we don't know this with respect to the brain. The science of brain is so primitive, we don't know hardly anything. One of my favorite books is Incognito by the neuroscientist down at Baylor. He's the one I negotiated with this contract. What's his name? David Eagleman. And interesting guy, really interesting guy. But he's just, he's on this quest, and he uses an example of how little we know. He said, we do fMRI on the brains. And his example in a talk I heard, he's fantastic. I think he's still searching personally. He's really searching, which is wonderful. I love to talk to him. He was the one I negotiated with on the fMRI studies. And he said that, I'm going to lose this thought, he said that an fMRI is like flying an airplane at 60,000 feet. And you might be able to see a fire, a big forest fire in England, but you can't see the bank robbery on the corner. Great way of putting it. I give a talk on neuroscience and neurotheology, which gets into this a little bit more, which I think it's a fascinating subject, because science is so primitive in this regard.
Is there a way to follow you? Is there a way to follow you?
Like
To
you have a
see where
Facebook page.
I'll drive slowly. Yes, I have a YouTube site that this will be on. I don't usually include the questions because I don't think that's fair to the questioners. But if you go to www.spiritualityandhealth.org, in fact, I should have put this up there. I wanted to spiritualityandhealth.org. And that I do blogs. And I did a blog on the product, it was titled Prodigal St. Petersburg. I did a trip to St. Petersburg, and so I do them on different subjects. I just did one on Malta medicine, So if you go under blogs and you see my name, click on my name, it'll give all of my blogs. That's one source. The other is YouTube site, Contemplative Network. And I've got a card that I have to actually look at and figure out where it's at. Yeah, YouTube/Contemplative Network. And that gives a lot of these presentations that I record. And plus presentations that I haven't seen anywhere else. One is a dialogue between Thomas Keating and Rabbi Schachter, Shalom Schachter. That rabbi is wonderful. He's a real solid contemplative. The other site is contemplative.net. So if you're interested, I can give you my cards if you don't want to write it all down. But those are probably the best ways to follow. I also do homilies at a church, St. Cecilia Church. And those are, of course, if you're not Catholic, it may not be of interest to you. But I usually mix science and the readings of that Sunday. And it's, you go to St. Cecilia's website under my name, and they're all texted, but they're also on the YouTube site that I record them.
Which church do you do homilies?
St. Cecilia Catholic Church on I-10 in Bunker Hill.
Okay.
Yeah. But I don't do them all the time. I mean, once a month or something like that.
You good?
I did have one more question, and that was that I enjoy sports. And so to me, it was very interesting that you were there with a Sufi and a Kabbalist. And I want to know how the game went. I mean, did you come to any consensus? What happened?
That, I recorded that, and that's on the YouTube site. It was a panel discussion I organized for the third annual Medicine and Religion Conference sponsored by the University of Chicago.
Okay.
And finding these people was a challenge. I want to tell you, I networked this nation. And the reason they're hard to find is, and this is not meant disparagingly, but many of the faiths are suspect of the mystical traditions.
Yes.
And I thought Christianity was suspect. Well, it's nothing like Islam and, to a certain extent, Judaism. Judaism, the reaction I got was, oh, this is just for the really high spiritual leaders. And I'm going, no, it's you can do this.
You mean for the Kabbalah or just the mystical?
Well, yeah, Kabbalah, however they pronounce it. And so that's not meant disparagingly, but I think all faiths are a little bit suspect of this because it's in their rich tradition, but they've become legalistic quite often. You know, back to that. And then the Sufis, they were harder to find because a real Sufi practitioner is hard to find. They will claim they're doing it, but when you talk to them, it's not quite there. Sometimes they'll claim. But I got it. And then the other challenge is I was trying to get people who were versed in medicine. So the Sufi I got was out of New York. He had a medical doctor. Wonderful. Oh, brilliant. He was absolutely fantastic. And when you're talking to a contemplative, you just relate. It's beyond dogma. I mean, you just relate. I knew that he had been in the same place. I use that word loosely. And one of my favorite Jewish contemplatives wouldn't call himself a Kabbalist, so he wouldn't participate. But I did a joint presentation with him. It's on YouTube, and his name is Harvey Gordon, and he's on the board of Contemplative Network, and he's a retired urologist, and I taught him century prayer. Yes, he had his own practice, but it wasn't Kabbalah. He kind of got it more from the Buddhist tradition. In fact, I've run into a lot of what they call themselves Bujus. I thought maybe that's like an insulting term. I mean, I said, no, this is okay, Buju. So he is absolutely wonderful, but so humble. I couldn't get him to give the presentation. So I got a rabbi, a lady out of Chicago who was excellent, a young woman. And then the moderator was a Jewish MD who had just gone to Israel and learned Kabbalah for the first time. So it was an interesting panel discussion.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you.